It was 5:47 a.m. on a Tuesday when my phone pinged with a subject line so dull I almost swiped it away. Annual HOA budget review urgent. I'm 58, semi-retired, and my mornings are sacred: coffee, crossword, porch. But something made me tap instead of delete. The first line said, "If you're concerned about your dues increasing again, reply to this email for details." I wasn't just concerned, I was furious. Our dues had gone up 3 times in 2 years while the playground rusted and the walking path crumbled. So I hit reply. The return email landed 3 minutes later with no greeting, no signature. Just, "Meet me at the community center kitchen door at 6:30. Bring no one." I remember staring at those words with my mug halfway to my mouth, thinking this had to be a prank. But I pulled on a jacket anyway. By 6:20, I was standing outside the kitchen door, steam rising from the storm drains, wondering what kind of idiot I'd become to follow a cryptic email. Then the door opened, and there stood Margaret from Lot 12, the quiet widow who always wore sun hats and never came to meetings, holding a manila folder so thick it looked like it could choke a filing cabinet. She pushed it into my hands without a word. Inside were printouts of invoices, bank statements, and handwritten notes in the treasurer's distinctive scrawl. Numbers circled. Arrows pointing to a single phrase: personal landscaping. Back in my kitchen, I spread the folder out across the table, pushing aside the crossword. Each page smelled faintly of copier ink and panic. At first, it looked like ordinary HOA paperwork: landscaping invoices, pool maintenance charges, playground repair quotes. But the numbers didn't add up. The same personal landscaping contractor had billed the HOA nearly $9,000 every other month, yet the common areas were dying brown. Some checks were made out directly to cash.m. My hands shook a little as I flipped to a page Margaret had highlighted. In the treasurer's neat handwriting were initials. MD, those weren't the treasurer's initials. They were the HOA president's. I leaned back in my chair, heart thudding, trying to remember every board meeting where we'd been told costs have gone up or unexpected repairs justified another dues hike. All the while, the president had been quietly funneling funds into his own yard, his own private oasis behind a tall privacy fence. I thought of Margaret, small, quiet Margaret, slipping me the folder at dawn like a spy. She had risked a lot just to hand me this. Why me? Because I was the one who always read the minutes, always asked questions no one else bothered with. I typed out a text to her. "I'm going through it now. Can we talk?" A few seconds later, 3 dots appeared, then vanished, then appeared again. Finally, she replied, "Community garden, 4 p.m. by the benches. No one ever goes there on weekdays." At 4 sharp, I sat on the bench under the sagging oak. She arrived with her sun hat pulled low, holding a thermos of tea. Up close, she looked even more fragile than I remembered, but her voice was steady. "I've been on the board for 15 years, she said. "I thought I was helping. But last month I found the duplicate invoices." She handed me a second, smaller envelope, handwritten notes of board conversations, times, dates, little things she had overheard but couldn't prove on her own. "I didn't know who else to trust," she said. "Everyone else thinks he walks on water. But I see the books. You're the only one who ever asks the right questions." I promised her I'd go through everything. She smiled faintly and said, "Be careful. He's charming when he's cornered." I went home that night with 2 envelopes and a knot in my stomach, realizing this wasn't just about money. It was about the kind of quiet corruption that grows when nobody looks. And somehow, the quiet widow and the semi-retired man with the crossword were about to become reluctant allies. Over the next few weeks, Margaret and I became co-conspirators in the smallest, most suburban sense of the word. We never said investigation out loud, but that's what it was. Every Tuesday, we met at the forgotten community garden on the edge of the subdivision, sitting on the same worn benches under the oak tree while the sprinklers hissed in the distance. She always brought a thermos of tea and a small paper bag of shortbread cookies she baked herself. I brought a notebook, a pen, and questions. Little by little, she handed me more. Old minutes she'd kept copies of just in case. Screenshots of bank transfers. Photographs she had quietly taken of the president's lavish backyard projects that seemed to match the invoices for community landscaping. Between the numbers, she told me pieces of her own life. How she and her husband had moved here in the 80s, thinking they'd retire among good neighbors. How after he died, volunteering for the HOA had been her way of staying connected, of feeling useful, and in return I began telling her things too. That I'd moved here after my divorce because the houses were affordable and the sidewalks safe. That I'd spent years at a corporate job writing memos nobody read and was only now learning how to fill my days. She listened without judgment, pouring more tea when my voice cracked. Our meetings weren't all grim. We joked about the ridiculousness of our situation, two quiet residents playing detectives over cookies and thermoses. She teased me about my messy handwriting. I teased her about her obsession with color-coded paper clips. And yet, beneath the small jokes, something was taking root. The more time we spent together, the more I saw the steel under Margaret's softness. She wasn't just a widow with a sun hat. She was someone who believed rules were supposed to protect people, and when they didn't, she refused to look away. And maybe she saw something in me too, someone who would actually read the fine print. Someone who still believed in fairness even when it was inconvenient. By the fourth week, we had enough evidence to prove the president had been siphoning HOA funds for at least 3 years. But evidence wasn't the same as justice. We needed a plan. One evening as the sun set behind the oak, Margaret capped her thermos and said, "If we're going to do this, we have to be smart. They'll call it gossip unless we show them the truth." I nodded, feeling the weight of the folder in my lap, realizing this quiet partnership had become something more than just saving money on dues. It was about standing up for a community that had stopped paying attention, and about the strange, unexpected friendship that was giving both of us a reason to show up every Tuesday. By the 5th week, our Tuesday meetings had shifted from comparing notes to planning moves. The folder on my kitchen table had doubled in size. Margaret now carried a small spiral notebook filled with dates, amounts, and initials. I had built a spreadsheet that showed every misused dollar in neat, undeniable columns. "1 late afternoon under the oak tree," she said. "If we just hand this to the board, they'll bury it. They'll call it a misunderstanding, vote in private, and nothing will change." I asked what she wanted to do instead. She took a slow sip of tea and said, "We show the homeowners. All of them. In one room. No way to spin it if they see the numbers themselves." The idea scared me more than I wanted to admit. I'd moved here for peace, not politics. But she was right. The corruption wasn't just theft, it was a kind of quiet disrespect for every neighbor who trusted the system. We started meeting twice a week. We divided tasks. I would turn the spreadsheets into a clear handout anyone could follow. She would discreetly call homeowners she trusted and ask them to come to the next open meeting. We rehearsed what to say, how to stay calm when the inevitable shouting began. Between lines of strategy, we still had our small rituals. She brought shortbread, I brought coffee. She told me about the garden her husband had once tended behind their house, how she still talked to his tools in the shed. I told her about my grown kids, how they lived in different states, how some days the quiet felt heavier than the walls. The more she opened up, the more I saw how much this fight meant to her. It wasn't just about money. It was about honoring the place she and her husband had built their life, about making sure it didn't rot from the inside out. And for me, it became about more than dues. It became about keeping a promise I hadn't known I'd made, to show up when someone believed in me. On the night before the meeting, we sat in my kitchen, surrounded by copies of our evidence. Margaret looked at me across the table and said, "No matter what happens tomorrow, thank you. You've already given me more courage than I had." I reached over and squeezed her hand and said, "You did the hard part. You spoke up. I'm just making sure people hear you." We packed the papers into 2 neat stacks. I walked her to her car. The sky was streaked with pink and gold, the kind of sunset that makes you believe in second chances. The community center smelled faintly of coffee, and floor waxed the night of the open meeting. Folding chairs lined up in crooked rows. The low buzz of conversation filled the air as neighbors drifted in, clutching water bottles and curiosity. Margaret sat beside me at the back table, her sun hat in her lap, her hands folded but steady. I had a stack of handouts in front of me and a knot in my stomach. The HOA president stood at the front, smiling the same polished smile he used at every gathering. He started with the usual pleasantries, budget constraints, rising costs, plans for beautifying the neighborhood. When he opened the floor for comments, Margaret and I exchanged a glance. She stood first. "I'd like to distribute some information," she said clearly, her voice cutting through the murmurs. I began handing out the packets row by row, each page showing the spreadsheet, invoices, and photographs. At first there was confusion, heads bent over papers, eyebrows rising. Then whispers. Then louder voices. "Wait a minute, are you serious?" The president tried to speak, but someone interrupted, pointing to a highlighted line. "This says you paid $9,000 to a landscaping company that doesn't even work here." He stammered something about clerical errors and miscommunications, but Margaret calmly began reading dates and amounts aloud, her notes precise and unshakable. I stood next to her, adding context when needed. The room shifted from polite to angry, from disbelief to determination. People who had never come to a meeting before were standing up, demanding explanations. The president's smile faltered. He tried to adjourn the meeting, but homeowners refused to leave. Someone motioned for a vote to remove him from the board pending investigation. Hands shot up. More than enough. It was over in minutes. Margaret's shoulders dropped as if she'd been holding her breath for months. She sat down and whispered, "I didn't think they'd believe me." I whispered back, "They didn't just believe you. They believed themselves once they saw it." As the meeting broke up, people came over to thank her, shaking her hand, some hugging her. A few thanked me too, but I kept pointing to Margaret. She had been the one to risk everything, walking out into the cool night, the two of us side by side. I realized we weren't just neighbors anymore. We were partners who had built trust out of paper, tea, and courage. And in that trust, something else had been born, a friendship that neither of us had expected but both of us needed. The week after the meeting felt like stepping out of a storm into a quiet room. The HOA president had been suspended pending a full audit. The board was scrambling to appoint interim officers, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood buzzed with energy that wasn't just complaints about dues. People waved at each other on the sidewalks. Neighbors who had never attended a single meeting sent Margaret thank you cards or dropped off baked goods at her porch. But the biggest change wasn't in the boardroom. It was in the slow, steady way Margaret and I began to inhabit each other's lives. Our Tuesday meetings didn't stop when the fight was over. They just changed shape. We met at the community garden still, but now we brought seeds and gloves instead of folders and evidence. We planted herbs in the neglected beds, laughing at how uncoordinated we were with trowels. She teased me for my crooked rows of basil. I teased her for treating rosemary like a pet. I started noticing small things about her I hadn't before. The way she hummed under her breath when she worked. The way she always left a place cleaner than she found it. She told me about the little traditions she and her husband had built, Sunday picnics by the lake, movie nights with old westerns. I told her about my grown children, about the silence of an empty nest, about how much I'd missed simply cooking for someone. Sometimes we'd end our gardening with coffee at her kitchen table. She would pull out old photo albums and tell me stories about the people in them, not in a wistful way but as if they were still part of the room. I found myself telling her about my own parents, about the farm kitchen where I'd learned to bake cornbread with my grandmother. We traded recipes and memories like neighbors trading sugar over the fence. There were still hard days. She had bouts of arthritis that kept her home. I had weeks where freelance work piled up and I was distracted. But even then, we texted small things. A picture of a tomato sprout pushing through soil, a line from a book, a reminder that the next HOA meeting was scheduled. The bond we'd built in secrecy and tension was becoming something gentler, rooted in ordinary acts of care. More than once I caught myself thinking how odd it was that an HOA budget had led me here, to a garden, to a friend, to a sense of purpose I hadn't known I'd lost. And I saw in Margaret a quiet glow, the kind of pride you get when you stand up for something bigger than yourself and come out the other side stronger. By midsummer, the community garden no longer looked forgotten. Rows of herbs and tomatoes had sprouted where weeds once ruled. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other before began stopping by to ask what we were planting. Margaret started keeping a box of extra seeds just to hand out. I brought my old folding chairs so people could sit for a while. What began as a hidden meeting spot for two reluctant whistleblowers slowly became a little hub of life. It was Margaret's idea to host a Sunday share, no flyers, no speeches, just an open invitation for anyone to bring something, a recipe, a cutting from a plant, a memory. At first, only a few came, a retired couple with a basket of lemons from their tree, a young family with a plate of brownies. But word spread. By the third Sunday, there were 20 people gathered under the oak tree. Children watered the herbs. Adults swapped tips about compost and cookie recipes. For the first time since moving in, I felt the neighborhood exhale. Margaret's eyes shone as she moved among the people, offering tea, answering questions. She whispered to me, "This is what I always hoped it could be." I looked around at the benches, the herbs, the laughter, and said, "It already is." The change wasn't dramatic like the board meeting had been. It was softer but deeper, a quiet mending of trust. People began volunteering for projects. Someone painted the cracked benches. Another built a little free library box. Someone else offered to fix the path lighting. And in the center of it all was Margaret, the woman who had once slipped me a folder at dawn, now hosting a circle of neighbors who didn't just know each other's names, but each other's stories. For me, the Sunday shares became more than a community event. They became an anchor, a reason to bake again, to plan, to look forward. Margaret and I still had our tea on Tuesdays, still shared recipes and small confidences, but now our friendship had spilled outward into something larger than both of us, and sometimes, as I watched her laugh with a child handing her a marigold or listened to a neighbor describe a family recipe, I thought about how close I had come to deleting that email, to never showing up at the kitchen door at dawn. The thought always left me with a strange ache, the kind of ache that makes you grateful. The first anniversary of the Sunday shares came around on a mild spring day. The garden was unrecognizable from the scraggly plot where Margaret and I had once whispered over manila folders. Herbs spilled over their beds. Painted rocks lined the pathways. A new wooden sign read, "Community Garden, all welcome." That morning, Margaret arrived early, carrying a basket of lemon bars. I brought a thermos of coffee. Neighbors drifted in with trays of food, seedlings, stories. Kids darted between the benches. The air smelled like cut grass, cinnamon, and something more elusive, a kind of collective relief. Margaret stood under the oak tree and for the first time addressed the whole group. Her voice shook a little but held. She thanked everyone for showing up, for helping turn a neglected patch of dirt into a place people wanted to be. Then she looked over at me and smiled, and I realized she wasn't just thanking them. She was thanking me, too, for answering an email, for reading the fine print, for not walking away. I felt a tightness in my throat as I looked around at faces I now knew by name. We had come together to stop a petty theft, but in the process we'd built something we hadn't planned, a community. Margaret had gained back her faith in her neighbors. I had found a friend who made my days feel purposeful again. And the whole street had gained a place to gather. Later, after everyone left, we sat together on the bench under the oak, sipping the last of the coffee. Margaret said quietly, "I don't think I would have done this without you." I shook my head. "You would have. You just needed someone to stand next to you." She smiled, eyes shining. "Maybe, but I'm glad it was you." Driving home that evening, I thought about the chain of tiny choices that had led here. Tapping on an email instead of deleting it. Showing up at a kitchen door at dawn. Sitting on a bench with a thermos and a stranger who would become a friend. How many times in our lives do we let those little invitations pass by? How many gardens never get planted because we don't open the folder, don't answer the call, don't knock back? That thought was my catharsis. A quiet, steady realization that small, unglamorous acts, reading, listening, showing up, can change more than budgets. They can change people. They can change you. And so I leave you with this question. What small choice did you make, or could you make, that might change your world in ways you can't yet imagine?